Okay, great. Well, I think we're going to get started here. So first off, I want to say hi to everybody. I'd like to thank you for joining us this morning or this evening, depending on where you are. My name is John Brennan. I'm a vice president with Wild Ventures, and I'll be leading our discussion here today. As most of you know, I'm sure, but I'll give you a quick refresher. Wild Ventures is a Silicon Valley-based seed fund focused on exclusively investing in Israel. So we're best known for our focus in cybersecurity. We also look at a lot of areas in enterprise software, as well as some emerging tech areas like autonomous vehicles, drones, and a few other spaces that we're currently exploring. Today's discussion is part of a series of webinars we do. So the goal of these is to bring together US-based experts with the Israeli entrepreneurial community. So if you've attended in the past, you probably know that oftentimes some of the best questions we get are actually from the audience and off the cuff. So please feel free to send in your questions starting now and throughout the conversation. Submit them via the Q&A tab or the chat tab, and we'll surface them as they come in. And one more note, Sharon, our marketing director, wanted me to mention that we are streaming live on Facebook, so be sure to like us there. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Nate Taggart from Stackery, who's been kind enough to talk with us today about serverless computing. Welcome, Nate.
Thanks, John.
Awesome. So, I think it might be helpful, Nate, for our audience if you could just start off by talking a little bit about Stackery and what you guys do there, and then we can jump into a little bit of your background.
Yeah, that sounds great. So Stackery is an enterprise serverless operations console. So there's a lot of tools in the emerging serverless space that help developers build serverless software. Stackery is really designed to help enterprises run serverless software, and that's both for organizing their teams, enforcing governance, and then also the core technical operations needs, observability, control over their rollouts, automation, et cetera.
Great. We're certainly going to dive into some of those areas you just mentioned. It'd be interesting for me to hear a little bit, about your background and how you kind of came into this space. It's not, I don't think it's the intuitive first area to start a company for a lot of people.
Yeah, no, when I was a kid, I did not grow up thinking I would do this, that's for sure. So my co-founder and I were both early employees at New Relic. New Relic provides performance monitoring for software companies. And I was the second product manager there, and Chase, my co-founder, he and I launched a product there where we took this old model of performance monitoring, which was traditionally served from the server side of the application, and we brought it into front-end browser-based JavaScript applications. And in the course of doing so, we really had to re-engineer a lot of the technology. And one of the big engineering challenges that we faced was creating a data ingestion pipeline that was able to take data from every single page load that every single one of our customers served. So a huge volume of data. You can kind of think of it like Twitter fire hose in reverse, slurping it all in. In fact, as a test, we ingested the Twitter fire hose in real time. So massive scale. And this was 5 or 6 years ago at this point, but in the years since, AWS initially, and now Azure and Google and many others have released serverless infrastructure products. And Chase and I, as a side project, we realized that we should play with this and see if we could rebuild this data ingestion pipeline. It solved a lot of those scalability, uptime, reliability problems that are really hard to solve with some legacy architecture models. Great,
really interesting. And so I think the first thing I'd really like to maybe get your thoughts on are, we've actually as a firm spoken to many enterprises recently and about their plans for serverless. And I think we get some mixed feedback and mixed messages on roadmap. So I'd love to hear, do you envision enterprises going fully serverless, or is this going to be part of just a piece of a puzzle of a much larger environment?
Yeah, so first off, it's already happening. Enterprises are embracing serverless. What you may run into, though, is that serverless is not being embraced as, at least today, it's not coming tops down. It's not a strategic technology choice. It's actually being brought in through developers, through engineering teams, who see it as a way to accelerate their velocity and frankly, just to ship the features that they're trying to ship. And so a lot of times, if you talk to a CTO and say, how important is serverless, they'll say, we're looking at it. We haven't made a move yet. But when you get down into what are they doing in their cloud accounts, you'll find a ton of serverless, including on mission critical applications. The other thing to highlight here is, as opposed to a technology like VMs or containers, there's not the same lift and shift story that you might expect of taking a legacy application, packaging it differently, and being able to redeploy it as is. Serverless is more than just an infrastructure technology. It's also a design pattern. And so it does change the way applications can be built. Because of this, what we see is the entry point for these organizations doing serverless tends to be building microservices around their legacy monolithic applications. So they're really using it in greenfield development, but to extend to these brownfield projects that they have.
That's great. That's great. And so when you think about, some of the biggest challenges, I think a lot of times we hear from enterprises, a pretty typical conversation is, yeah, we're really interested, we find it fascinating, the developers really like it, but we can't use it for XYZ mission critical functions. So maybe talk about, what are the biggest challenges for enterprises to prevent them from adopting this technology?
Yeah, there are a couple of different challenges. One thing that enterprises, when enterprises pick a technology, they have a pretty high bar of what maturity looks like for that technology before they'll embrace it. And there's been exceptions along the way. We've seen certain technologies just take off in the enterprise. I think when Node.js came out, the enterprise adoption curve of that programming language was just incredible. It happened overnight, it felt like. Serverless is kind of doing the same thing. The difference here, though, is that because serverless changes the model of how these applications are built, it shifts responsibility around the team, which means that there are some skills gaps. There are people who are using serverless technology that are missing some key skills to be successful. And we can dig in and talk about those. But the other is that there's a lot of checkboxes that an enterprise has that they need to tick off before they can adopt a technology. How do we test this? How do we reliably and automatically release this? How do we roll it back if there's a crisis? How do we ensure we have observability, auditability, inventory control, governance, security, obviously? And so I think what we're seeing happening right now is that those are the opportunities that the ecosystem can fill. There's white space between the cloud products, the base resource that these developers are consuming, AWS Lambda, Microsoft Functions, and then the operational workflow needs that enterprises are going to have in order to use this in production on their most mission critical applications.
Interesting. And one thing you said there jumped out to me. You talked about maybe some of the skill sets that are needed, and this leads me to a question I was going to ask later, but what are some of the biggest challenges at the developer level from adopting serverless? And I think a lot of people see it as a big opportunity as developers driving this, but I'd be interested to hear some of the obstacles from that perspective as well.
Yeah, for sure. I think first off, it's important to highlight serverless has a lot of developer advantages. It gives control in a lot of ways to developers. They can iterate very quickly. They can usually ship software more quickly. And then for the organization, it tends to be a lot cheaper too. So developers, nobody's saying no necessarily. On the other hand, the developer model is changing quite a bit. You can imagine in a container world or even a VM world, you are able to recreate that production environment locally. So your test cycle can be done locally. You can iterate very quickly on your code and immediately see the change in a production-like environment, even if it's running locally. And that really shifts in a lot of ways with serverless. Keep in mind, serverless is just, generally, when we're talking about it in the sense of functions as a service, we're talking about the compute side of it, running the code, executing the code. But real applications string together a bunch of different services in the cloud. So you might be using an API gateway to create API endpoints. You might be using Lambda for your functions, may have Dynamo or RDS for database, an S3 bucket. I mean, you can see that you have to assemble all these pieces. And the tricky thing for developers is that you can't replicate all of AWS on your local machine. So the development model for serverless tends to be build your code. You might test your functions locally, but then ship that code into the cloud and then run through your integration testing or your manual testing there in the cloud. So that means developers have to be able to automatically release very quickly. They have to figure out how to build that release pipeline. They have to figure out how to configure their cloud account so that they have a separate developer environment that is sandboxed away from production. And they're looking for ways to essentially string together all of the workflow. How do I link my GitHub code to my AWS account and push through a release project, and then do that quickly so that I can iterate and not be slowed down. And so there are some development challenges along the way.
Makes sense. And I'll just add too, I've got my questions here, but we have a great audience, and we'd love to see some Q&A from the audience. So anything that's on your mind, feel free to send along. So Nate, related a bit, we talked about the enterprises a little bit, we talked about the developers a little bit. When you think about enterprise leadership in the space and in terms of adoption, because I think we see quite a few, you go to conferences, you read blogs, there's a lot of talk about serverless, but who do you really see, or who comes to mind as an enterprise leader in terms of serverless adoption, and why do you think that is?
Yeah, so maybe counterintuitively, we're seeing a lot of leading serverless adoption from industries that have historically been technology laggards. Now, the companies themselves, a lot of times, are very sophisticated companies that are making this selection. But the interesting thing here is it's not coming from who you might think of as a tech early adopter. These aren't, Silicon Valley unicorns leading the way. Nordstrom is a huge serverless adopter. Capital One, iRobot, who makes Roombas. So I think, if you look at who's embracing serverless early, the interesting trend that we've found is that they tend to be organizations that have a highly transactional workload. So think about iRobot for a minute. So they make the robotic vacuums, Roombas, self-driving vacuums. And those devices all independently need to connect back through an API to the back end. So you have this very bursty API workload. It's not being driven by humans, it's machine driven. And so, the machines can be turned off and turned on, and you never know when exactly they're gonna hit. And that scaling challenge that they faced, they solved with serverless. The two techniques they could have used are to over provision, to basically always have more capacity than they need for their server to backend, or use serverless, which is metered more granularly. It's metered at a transaction level. And so they found that serverless helped them scale, helped them manage costs, help them drive the cost of their products down, or contain the cost of servicing those products. And there's a compelling business case there. Compare that to someone like Google. At Google's scale, they have such predictable traffic. If they are serving 70% of the internet, there's not a lot of spikes they can have off of that traffic. And so at their scale, while it's huge traffic, it tends to look more predictable. The burstiness, the transactional nature that serverless is really great at supporting is not a huge benefit comparatively.
Interesting. So do you think we'll see, when we think about maybe the next generation Googles and Facebooks, do you think when enterprises are starting out as startups and then growing, do you think we'll see more of those traditional tech players be heavy serverless users?
It's interesting. I would actually say no. I think today what we're looking at is kind of a fork in the road with enterprise infrastructure. And these are not exclusive choices. You can use both. But the patterns in front of you are serverless or containers orchestration. So if you have, if managing your infrastructure is a core business differentiator, if it's a competitive advantage for you to be good at that, I think you're gonna gravitate towards a container and orchestration model. You'll use Docker, you'll use Kubernetes, so that you can drive flexibility. And the trade-off there is complexity, cost, and overhead, an operational overhead, and a big skill requirement to run those systems well. Comparatively, and I think this is actually a good thing. For most of the market, 80% of the market, infrastructure is not a differentiator. They really don't need to develop as a core competency for their business, the ability to manage complex enterprise backends, right? They're doing very predictable things. They're serving web traffic. They're serving API requests. And so I would say what serverless affords is a way to commoditize those core use cases, make it easier for companies to develop against them, build faster, and contain costs. And the trade-off there is that they're not developing that orchestration as a core competency. And if for that business that doesn't matter, that's a pretty good deal. But I do still think that there's going to be some companies that really feel like that is a competency that if they can't master, they're going to lose in the market.
Great. And so this brings me to a question that I know is on everyone at Wild Ventures' mind, given our focus. So what are the security implications of serverless adoption? And maybe let's separately talk about some of the benefits and risks. Maybe start out, what are some of the benefits from a security perspective of serverless adoption?
Yeah, so serverless has, I think, first off, I think there's a lot of this thinking that's yet to emerge. I think people are still really figuring out the serverless model. I argue that serverless has some security advantages right out of the gate. First off, you have these instances, these compute instances, which spin up on demand and then immediately shut down after the transaction. They are by their nature stateless. And so if you were to establish a malicious payload into that request, you're not leaking into anyone else's transaction. You don't necessarily have observability there. And I don't mean to say there's no way for it to be done, but I mean it's not a typical pattern where you can just malform a request and see other users' data. So a lot of isolation, a lot of granularity. The other advantage is a separation of concerns. You can think about the permissions that you have to assign to a machine or a container, right? If you have an entire application, you have to give that container, in a lot of cases, there's exceptions of course, but you have to give that container all the permissions that it needs to do all the things that application needs to do. So that may be connect to public internet, that may be connect to a private database. Comparatively though, with a serverless model, you can break that up, you can decompose that into multiple functions and give each of those functions very granular permissions and what they're able to do. Which doesn't mean that there's not still a data flow through the application that can make it all the way to something sensitive, but it does mean that you're able to really isolate vulnerable areas of the application and lock them down more securely.
Great. And then how about some of the risks, and maybe in the context of what might be preventing some of these larger organizations from jumping right in?
Yeah, so first off, I think the big risk is really more of a question mark, and this is what's preventing companies from doing it. Their existing tooling does not work anymore. And it's not to be to say there's nothing. They can still put a firewall in front of their traffic or something. But if they're used to instrumenting their code for security monitoring, they may find that the software tools that they've used to do that no longer fit in the serverless model. There's no server to go install code onto. There's also a big organizational shift that has to happen. Developers now have to instrument for both operational concerns and security concerns during the development cycle. There's no way to retroactively go and look. So for example, let's take logs. if you just want to see logs. If you're not configuring your Lambda to log the data that you want to see, there's no server that you can SSH into after the fact and pull data out of. That data's gone forever. The instance spins up, it shuts down, data's gone. So what this does is it shifts the burden of responsibility. And I would argue this is a good thing. This is the shift left model. It's shifting these operational and security needs into the developer. And that requires that the developer master this new skill. And it also requires that there's a sense of discipline that these tasks are getting completed on every single function, on every single release, and that there aren't any gaps. So that's, again, an opportunity for automation. You could standardize that for your releases, that can tick the box for you.
Great. And we do have a question from the audience, and I think it makes sense given who we're speaking to over in Israel. So we'll shift gears just a little bit. And Dan wants to know a little bit more about your investment round. And I'll rephrase it just a bit to ask, so what did you think about in terms of raising capital, and what were your goals in doing so at Stackery?
Yeah, so we were really focused on the partner that we got and sharing a vision particularly with the first investment partner we had. Serverless is an emerging market. And I think if you ask the investor community, they're all looking at it and they're all interested. It's a hot space right now. There's a lot of hype and buzz, but the big question mark is, when is the right time, right? If they invest too early and it takes 5 years to heat up like containers did, that may not fit their fund dynamics. Certainly kills their IRR potentially. Compare that to they wait too late and there's already an established market leader and now there's an incumbent that somebody has to displace, which is achievable, but that's a harder mission. So I think the big question mark that the investors we talked to had was, how big is this market? Who is the market? When is it happening? And what we did, and we worked very hard to do this, is we found a partner who was willing to take some risk there. They were willing to ask those questions and know that we don't have a crystal ball, and neither do they. But that they fundamentally saw the trend emerging, and so for us, it was really that kind of a story. Now we raised our seed round in April. We did it right at the tail end of Techstars. We were in Techstars at the time. Mm-hmm. And I think we got great partners. We did a $2 million seed round, which, for us in our market, as early as it was 2 guys. It was me and Chase. I was really happy with the makeup of the round and also, who we got involved at that stage.
Yeah, well, that's great, and congratulations again on the round. As we see every day, timing is obviously something we think a lot about, and you get in a really exciting space like this, and figuring out both the right team to back, the right approach to take to the market, and the right timing to do it is a challenge. So I empathize with your comments for sure. One thing you probably did hear a bit about when you were raising capital and when you were in Techstars is, can serverless platform startups compete with the big cloud vendors? And what are some examples of where they should be trying to compete and where they shouldn't be trying to compete? And obviously this could be a day-long discussion, but I'd be interested to hear from your experience and your fundraising experience, or just your views in the market in general, what your reaction to that would be.
Yeah, so first off, serverless is a big space. It means a lot of things, and there's a lot of opportunity for startups in that ecosystem. And this, by the way, has been a pattern with a lot of different technologies. I think, 10 years ago, there was a question, could companies like New Relic and AppDynamics compete against cloud vendors? And now we have, a $4 billion public company in New Relic and a $4 billion acquisition in AppDynamics. So clearly, you can compete against cloud vendors. And I think the way that you do that is you build adjacently to their market without, and stay out of their turbines, right? Stay out of their path. And to do that, I think you have to have a pretty sophisticated and mature view on what it is that they're strategically trying to do and how they think about the market. And you need to, keep visibility into that so that you can align without getting crushed. Our thinking is that Amazon, we'll take just as an example to be specific. Amazon is a commodities business. They want to do volume, and they want their services to be very generic, powerful, and they want to have a lot of services. And they want you to be able to take all these individual pieces and build whatever you want. And in that way, they can win. They can guarantee a win. Nobody can buy more servers than Amazon. Nobody in the world. So if it comes down to who can buy the most servers, who can use, economies of scale to drive costs as low as possible, Amazon's a guaranteed victor at this point. But when it comes to value-add software, that's actually high risk for Amazon. If they try to build, custom use case driven software, workflow software, they may win. They have a great engineering team. They certainly are capable of doing well, but they're not guaranteed victors, right? And so another company can come along, can understand that market very well, can find a niche, potentially find an entry point that's so small it's unattractive for Amazon to begin with, and then land and expand from there and take over, I think, a big opportunity. And that's by the way, that's what I saw when I was at New Relic. They started in performance monitoring, but specifically they started monitoring Ruby on Rails applications. That's all they did. It was niche, but it was a spearhead into the market. They got established, they were able to expand from there and able to build an IPO scale opportunity out of that idea.
That's great. Yeah. And I think, oftentimes when we speak with, our portfolio companies or prospective companies, we talk a lot about that go-to-market strategy. And sometimes it is solving a really specific problem for a large organization and then growing from there. So I think there's some echoes of that in your answer as well. We have a great question from TJ Gonan actually on the chat. So do you think companies going serverless are going to standardize on one cloud platform, or do you think it's going to be multi-cloud or cloud agnostic?
Yeah, it is a really good question, and I think jury's out. But my opinion is this. Companies talk about being cloud agnostic. They talk about a fear of vendor lock-in. And in a large organization, an enterprise that has thousands of engineers, there are pockets in that organization that are in fact using different clouds already. But when it comes to this idea of cloud portability, of being able to move, from AWS to Azure on demand at a moment's notice, I think the reality is that's a nice to have, but not a need to have, and it's actually pretty hard to do. It's relatively simple to move your serverless code, your functions. Mm-hmm. Not trivial, but I mean that's an achievable path. Same would be true of containers, by the way. You could take your Docker instance and run that anywhere. But the data side is a much harder story. If you have terabytes of data in AWS, just the time alone to move that is tricky. The cost of replicating and keeping mirrored instances available in multiple clouds, just in case you may one day do it, I think it becomes untenable pretty quickly. And there may be certain use cases where it's such an important need, or they see one cloud vendor as having too much influence in their particular market, like Walmart, for example, with they maybe have a view on Amazon. So I think we'll hear about it, and that'll continue to be a story. But the truth of the matter is, I don't believe in vendor lock-in, which isn't to say there isn't vendor lock-in. There is. But there's lock-in on every single decision you make. Which programming language you use creates lock-in. It's a pain to change that. Which libraries, which frameworks, which database, every time you make a decision, you create lock-in, and it's difficult to extract from that. So trying to say that, cloud providers specifically bear this risk, I'm skeptical.
Great. Well, TJ, great question, and thanks to David and TJ for the questions that have come in. Keep them coming. So one thing we hear, in almost every blog post, if someone kind of writes up what is serverless, you hear the phrase serverless is not operationsless. And so what should DevOps teams be focusing on in a serverless environment, and how do you see their role evolving?
Yeah, so serverless is high in the hype cycle right now, which means we're all, enthusiastic about the benefits and we're all blind to the problems. And one of the untrue things that was hyped early in serverless was that it's no ops. There are no operational requirements that a company has to fulfill to use serverless. And the traditional ops requirements, by the way, are things like packaging, CI/CD, release pipelines, scaling, reliability, uptime, and then, of course, monitoring, observability, recovery. And if you look at that list, and it's an incomplete list for what it's worth, there are some things that you outsource. You are not responsible for scaling anymore. You're not responsible for orchestration. You're not responsible for reliability in the sense that you don't need to configure your hardware to be reliable and handle failures. But there's a big chunk of that of course you're responsible for. Amazon is not responsible for the health of your code, for errors in your software, for the availability of the services that you attach your serverless code to, which every application is going to have. And so the trick here is not that serverless is no ops. The trick is that it changes who needs to do ops. I would argue it's impossible to have a mature serverless program if you can't also build a mature DevOps program. Because fundamentally, your developers are going to be in charge of instrumenting the application for observability, of configuring logging, configuring metrics collection, and then seeing and maintaining the health of that application. And if they're not taking care of it, your ops team doesn't have anything they can see or do anyway. So I think what's happening here is not that it's no ops, but that there's a shift, there's a shared responsibility in ops, and some of it gets outsourced to the cloud vendor. And frankly, that's an advantage if you ask me. But the health of your code, your application, that's going to be on you forever.
Great. And actually related to something you just mentioned about observability and going back, actually, we just got another question from the audience. It relates to the AWS as a competitor question. And so, we as a firm have actually seen a lot of solutions focused on observability, monitoring, debugging. And I think that's an area that a lot of startups feel like there is an opportunity, where there is an opportunity. Is this something you see AWS baking into their functionality, whether it's into X-Ray, whether it's into another horizontal service? How do you view that shaking out? And it's a pretty specific question, but I think it's something, an area we still see a lot of opportunity, but also we do have some questions.
Yeah, for sure. So, first off, it's clear that Amazon knows observability is important, and they release services to support that need. If you release a Lambda, it will automatically capture some metrics and put them into CloudWatch. Similarly, it'll capture a transaction event and put that into logs in CloudWatch. They have a product called X-Ray, which is specifically designed for tracing transactions, distributed tracing through your application. And I think it wouldn't be outside of their wheelhouse to say, start to provide more performance metrics, particularly considering that this is an infrastructure model that is very closely tied to how long does it take your code to run. So that said, I do think that there's a lot of space around that for startups to work in. First off, Amazon is really great at doing the first 30% of everything, right? They will give a basic offering, and it will support, a broad but very generic and general use case. Anyone who has used CloudWatch knows that as a logging platform, it's not great. It's good, it's adequate, it does the job in a lot of cases, it is a solution, and it's built in, so it can be very convenient. But there's a reason that there are still logging vendors in the market. Similarly, look at infrastructure as code. Amazon released CloudFormation. CloudFormation kind of sucks. It's really powerful, but it's hard to use and it's hard to ramp up on. And that's why there's companies like Terraform in the market. And so I think what I would focus on if I was a startup was taking a specific pain, a specific use case, and building that through to maturity. And I think you can still build an MVP around that. It's about going deep, not broad, and then expand from there. Use adjacent opportunities and create leverage with what you develop early. And I do think that there's a way to build still IPO scale businesses in the shadow of Amazon. And for that matter, if you can build them in a way that are generic and also support Amazon and support Google and support, other even private clouds potentially, I think that, there's a lot of space here.
That's interesting. And you mentioned, building IPO scale businesses. So maybe, what's your view if for entrepreneurs thinking about starting a company now in this space or who have already started a company in this space, how should they be thinking about exits and what is it to a cloud provider? Is it an IPO? Where do you see the bulk of that, the liquidity coming from down the road?
Yeah, so first off, it's a philosophical belief of mine. This is not necessarily any market intelligence I have, that you should be building an IPO scale business or you shouldn't be doing this. If you don't want to build an IPO scale business, that's perfectly fine, but maybe it's not venture capital. Maybe that's not the right path for you. There are certainly small investors, angels, family offices. There's another route you can take. You can bootstrap it. You can grow a lifestyle business, and that is a perfectly acceptable thing for entrepreneurs to do. You can have a great outcome. But if you're going the venture route, if you're not planning for a fund returning event, you are not going to be competitive in the venture market. So I tend to look at these as what can we do that is IPO scale. Now, that doesn't mean IPO is the best or only outcome. I do think there's acquisition opportunities, generally not with Amazon. They make some acquisitions, but the biggest acquisition that they've made that I know about, AWS, on the AWS side, the biggest acquisition they've made is Elemental, which is a kind of a video transcoding, or started as hardware, became software. And that fits very naturally into AWS. It's just a service they can offer alongside all their other services. And I think that exit was between 300 and 400 million. So certainly, that's attractive. That's a success by anybody's standards, I think. But that's the biggest. So we're not seeing Amazon do $2 billion acquisitions in the space. They didn't, they could have taken New Relic off the table. They could have competed for App Dynamics, and you didn't see them do that. Microsoft, on the other hand, I think does have a more active acquisition strategy, particularly around cloud today. And so I think just strategically, if you were looking at cloud vendors, where was the opportunity? It probably is going to come on the Azure side, at least in the immediate term. That said, I think there are other paths out. In particular, some of the legacy IT companies are really struggling to find a way to modernize in the cloud world. Oracle, IBM, there are big behemoth companies who have billions to spend and would love to find a really, a winning story to tell for this next generation of hardware and software. And so, if you can help them extend their business to a new generation, I think you could have a huge outcome that's not an IPO.
That's great. That's great. I think I love the way you said, if your investors, they're just going to want a fund returner. And I think that speaks, we touched on it briefly earlier, but when you think about your partner and you think about who the right person is, getting an investment from a $50 million fund or a $75 million fund is very different than getting an investment from $1 billion fund. And I think it's really important for entrepreneurs to know who they're partnering with and making sure incentives are aligned. And I know at Wild Ventures, that's something we really focus on. And we make sure that we're all on the same page. We're investing at the very, very early stages here, and I think it's something that we do a good job of communicating with our entrepreneurs.
Yeah, and I would also extend that, just as a tip for entrepreneurs to be looking at, not only the size of the fund, because that is definitely going to align with your outcome, but also the age of the fund. Getting in as an early investment on a new fund, or a new generation from an existing firm, has a very different expected timeline than being the last investment out of that fund.
Yeah.
And you should be mindful of that. You should be asking those questions. If this is a partner who you want to work with, they're going to be giving you honest answers along the way. So.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And I don't want this to turn into a Wild Ventures infomercial, so I won't dive too deep on our thoughts there. But we got another great question from TJ. It's in the chat, and he's wondering, do you see tooling security operations tools for serverless being independent segments, or maybe another way to phrase this is a good example, app performance monitoring. Is this going to be something that New Relic does as part of their solution, or is this a standalone startup that competes on its own from a serverless perspective?
So I think it's really going to depend on the segment that we're talking about. If we're talking about infrastructure as code, for example, Terraform, Terraform can support serverless in terms of they can provision, but the serverless model has really changed, right? Where you now have to package each of your functions individually with all of their dependencies. You're probably looking for a very fast iterative release cycle so that developers can quickly test their code in their development account. And so I think there's just a kind of a difference in needs between Terraform's core business and serverless users, which may mean that it's hard for them to really take serverless to maturity with their offering. Now, Terraform's part of HashiCorp, who's released a number of great products, and who knows, they could go in that direction for sure. But on the other hand, look at someone like New Relic. New Relic has shown a real maturity in evolving their technology as the ecosystem has evolved. They started with Ruby on Rails. They now support 6 or 7 different programming languages. They have a mobile offering, they have a front-end offering, they have infrastructure-based offerings. For them to support serverless, I think it's a no-brainer. I think they'll be able to do it, and frankly, I don't want to go head-to-head with them on that. But here's the interesting opportunity, is can you provide serverless-specific functionality for people who want to use New Relic for monitoring? For example, auto instrumentation. There may be an opportunity there to, maybe it's more of a, governance type product where you say, we can ensure that every function release is monitored, right? With your existing vendor, right? Or, think about maybe from that infrastructure as code standpoint, maybe you say, hey, we have a release pipeline that helps developers sandbox development accounts, but still pulls that provisioning out of a Terraform script. And so, I think if you can kind of help companies bridge the tooling that they have to do the things that they want to do, there's a new opportunity. And again, I don't think that's the only opportunity. I don't think you're pigeonholed there. I think that's the tip of the spear. You establish that relationship, you have a footprint in these organizations, and then you can find what are the adjacent problems and pain points and expand your value.
Great. And so maybe take a step back and look forward. We have this conversation again in 2 years and 3 years and 5 years. What are the biggest differences in terms of what we're talking about then from a serverless computing perspective?
Yeah, so first off, I think serverless will go from, I think when we talk about serverless, I'm guessing we're all talking about AWS Lambda, maybe Azure Functions, but we're talking about fundamentally a public cloud managed service. And I think what we will think in 5 years from now is that serverless is a technique, it's a pattern, it's an architecture, it's a design choice, and that there are a lot of supporting technologies that fit that model. We're already starting to see serverless databases emerge. Some of them act very much like managed services, but I think if you were to say, what makes it serverless is that as an engineer, I don't have to know mechanically what the hardware is or how that works. And I think we can broaden our definition and we can start to see serverless offerings in a lot of different layers of the technology stack. So first off, broadening definition, and I think that means it's going to expand much more heavily into private cloud. We're already seeing some early movement there, but I don't think anything's truly established yet. And then the other thing, and this is kind of exciting, but the CNCF just basically started a working group for serverless. So I think we are going to start to see serverless and containers talked a lot more in terms of how they work together, and we'll start to see more overlap there, and it will stop looking maybe so one or the other, which I don't believe. I don't think it is one or the other. Mm-hmm. And in fact, we have Amazon released AWS Fargate, which is very hybrid. It's a Docker container on demand. So it's serverless in the sense that you're not managing the underlying cluster or hardware, and it can be event driven, but it's still container based. So you can provide your own runtime. You have a lot of flexibility in the amount of resources you can consume, how long it runs. And so I think we'll see a blurring of the lines where these technologies start to support and complement each other.
Great. And I think we just got a question from Erez Berkner over in Tel Aviv, another entrepreneur, and he's wondering, what are some of the strategic decisions that you're really thinking about right now for Stackery, and what are some of the big decision points that I guess maybe you either have faced or anticipate having to face in the future when it comes to the company?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it looks like Dan also had a question here about, did we pivot along the way? And I can probably answer both of these together.
Perfect.
So no, I wouldn't say we pivoted, but we certainly have iterated, and we've learned, and we've adjusted. We've adjusted our messaging quite a bit, and we're still adjusting our messaging. And going forward, I think there's a lot of strategy around how do we position and how do we talk to these enterprises in a way that really resonates with them and makes them comfortable not only with serverless technology, but with Stackery as a partner in that. In that vein, I would say we started out very heavily operations focused. When Chase and I started this business, we realized, having used Lambda ourselves, that building Lambda was easy. There were a lot of options. I'd say it's, developer tools can be somewhat commoditized. There's a lot of open source. But operating these applications in production at scale under real workloads in firefighting mode, there was not a lot of support to do that well. And we wanted to build that. And as we built that, and as we started talking to some of these enterprises, we're generally having conversations at a VP level, and they have an operation need. It was real. We didn't make that up, but it fits alongside a broader organizational need that they have. They're looking for standardization and consistency across all developments, right? Serverless is being brought in by these individual developers or these teams, and each of them are following slightly different patterns. And then at the VP level, they go, oh, how do we audit this? How do we even know what we have in our inventory? How can we ensure that everything has the appropriate security policies and that everything's logging? And so these more, I think, enterprise-centric, organization-centric, even collaboration-centric needs are really the strategic focus that we as a company will have this year and moving forward. And this is we're a year and a half old at this point, so we're still very much learning. We're still very much iterating, and we're going to continue to work with our customers to help figure out what are the biggest pain points that we can solve for them.
Really helpful, really interesting. So, we only have a few minutes left here, so I think I'd like to jump ahead to a question that I think our audience is certainly interested in is, what would your advice be for entrepreneurs who are either thinking about starting something in this space or who have decided to do something in this space but haven't quite figured out exactly what yet? We'd love to hear your, what advice you would have liked a year and a half ago if you could give it to yourself.
Yeah, so I hope I'm not stomping on anyone's dreams here. I won't say that.
That's it. Stomp away.
Here's the thing. I have an engineering background, software development background. So does my co-founder. What we've seen as a pattern is that in this market, in the software market that sells to other engineers, it's very tempting for engineers to look at the tools available in the market and say, I can do better than this. I can build my own. I can improve the offerings that are available, and then to try to start a business around that. And they're focused on fundamentally their own needs. Now, what that means is because software developers know how to do this, solve for themselves, there is a saturation in the tooling market for developers. And that instead, there's a gap, there's an opening where these developers can also be solving for other constituents within the organization. It can still be technology focused. I think it'd be much more interesting to solve for the security of serverless than to solve for how to build a serverless app. I think it'd be much more interesting to solve for how to test serverless applications. There are no good integration test processes in the market right now. And I think there's a real void that can be filled, which is not, again, how do I build? It's maybe part of the development cycle, but, and then organizationally, think about like, how is serverless going to impact accounting, right? How do you bill back for this? You're paying based on how much a service is being consumed. If multiple teams are consuming that service, how do you appropriately prorate the invoice to the team responsible for that cost? And I think if you could start to solve some of these broader company challenges that serverless creates, ride the serverless technology wave, but don't focus on just developers. I think there's a bigger, more lucrative opportunity there that's harder to see, that you'll have less competition on, and that you'll have a lot more success building, again, an IPO scale organization out of.
Awesome. Absolutely. I think those are some great ideas. And, to our audience, as people start thinking about where to start companies, obviously this is an area Wild Ventures is interested in, and we'd love to hear your thoughts as you go through your ideation processes as well.
For sure. And if anyone solves that testing problem, let's partner. Reach out.
Perfect.
Cool.
Great. Well, so I think we're pretty much out of time. I want to thank a few people here. First, Sharon and Nitzan, the Wild Ventures marketing team, did a really great job putting this together. So I want to thank them. I want to thank the audience, really engaged, asked some great questions. It's definitely additive to the conversation. And of course, Nate, I want to thank you as well for giving us some of your time. It's been a really fun conversation.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks so much for having me. It's I really think this is an exciting market, and I like to see the interest here. I like to see other entrepreneurs taking the time to dig in on where they can add value in this space.
Great. And if people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that? Twitter, LinkedIn? Is there a preferred method?
Yeah, either one is fine. I'm Nate at stackery.io. Shoot me an email. I'm easy to reach.
Great. And the same goes for me. I am John at wildventures.com. It's on the website, very easy to find, and always happy to hear from the audience. So Nate, I think with that, we'll thank you and we'll sign off here. And I want to thank you again for such a great conversation.
Great. Thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Take care.